Connecting BackTrack to a network. Some changes have been made over the last few revisions of BackTrack, including the default behavior for networking. It's important to be aware of, and it's also important to be able to configure the IP address that we want to use on an interface. We're going to cover all that in this nugget. Let's begin. So let's imagine that you and I have gotten the go-ahead from our management to start doing some penetration testing, and so we've downloaded BackTrack, we installed it, we looked at that in the previous video, and we're ready to go. Now, one of the key elements of getting this to work is we need to have some connectivity to the network. And it could be wireless or it could be wired, and here's what I'd recommend. A lot of times people use laptops because they're fairly portable for using with BackTrack. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to have a local area network connection that's wired. I would recommend you do the same. And then we'll use the wireless for additional investigation and some attacks that we're going to be doing together in this series. But that's how I have mine wired. I've got a laptop, a physical standalone laptop, and I've also got my virtual machine, and they're both pretty much configured the same way. I've got a logical wired connection on my virtual machine through VirtualBox, and I also have the Alpha card that we mentioned in our previous nugget that has direct access by this virtual machine. So it's as if the Alpha wireless USB card belongs to this machine, and my virtual machine also believes it has a wired connection off to the network. So let's say we have our physical cable over to the switch, and now we're physically connected. Here's a big change with BackTrack in its current versions. BackTrack used to have networking disabled by default. You had to actually go to the command line and enable networking for it to work. Well, current versions of BackTrack, including the ones we're using in this Nugget series, they have networking enabled by default. That means if we plug into a switch, we're automatically going to start asking for DHCP services. So if that's not your intent, you may want to hold that thought, not connect to the network, configure your IP address settings that we're going to take a look at right here, and then once you're perfectly set the way you want to be, then go ahead and connect the cable. That way you're not tipping your hat as far as letting any devices know, hey, there's a new MAC address, he's asking for an IP address, if that's not what you want to do. So DHCP or static, we can be wired or wireless. Again, I strongly recommend we use our wired connection for our base connectivity for the system, and then we can start doing our penetration testing and other tests with our wireless interface. So with the current flavor of BackTrack, if you just want to use DHCP, you don't need to enable it. It's on by default. If you want to go ahead and disable some service or an interface, you'd want to do that manually before you connect. What I also like to do is also enable SSH. Now, why is that? So let's say I have this laptop, or we have this laptop, and we park it somewhere in our network, and we don't want to have to sit at the actual console to do a lot of our command line work. If we enable SSH on this guy and he's parked in like a wiring closet or some other convenient place, we can then go ahead and use SSH from wherever we are to connect to that device and run our command line utilities, which is very, very convenient not to physically have to be at that box to manage it. So we'll take a look at configuring the IP details, including how to configure a static IP address and how to make those details persistent. If you want the IP address to be the same every time after you reboot, I'm going to walk you through that as well. So here's our BackTrack system. We installed this in the previous nugget of installing BackTrack. And my question for you is, do you recall, can you tell me how exactly do we log on to this? It's booted up, it's staring at us, asking us to log on. As I recall, the actual user account is root. Do you remember what the password is for root? Now, if you're saying, Keith, it's root backwards, T-O-O-R, you're absolutely right on the money. So I'm going to type that in. And now we are connected. Also, I just want to confirm, because we did the install previously, I just want to verify that we're on the right system. So here it's showing us that I've got 56.2% of 19.55 gig. That's really close to what we gave it inside of VirtualBox in this virtual machine. So that's a handy little indicator that just gives a confirmation that we are booting from the actual hard disk and not actually booting from a CD still. We also have this IP address, and this is because, and I haven't changed anything yet, Ethernet 0 is connected to a network where there's a DHCP server. So by default, this flavor of BackTrack, when it booted up, it said, hey, I want to do a discover for a DHCP server. There was an offer. There was a request by this BackTrack saying, yeah, I'll take that address. And then there was an acknowledgement from the DHCP server. So this is the IP address we have. Now, if we wanted to just use that, it's good to go. We should have also learned things like our default gateway and DNS lookup information, and we're ready to go. One way of verifying what our IP address is, let's say we didn't have this boot screen sitting here at the moment. We want to just verify our details. We can do an if config. and that works great. So with an IF config, we have this Ethernet 0, which is my LAN interface. It says it's up. There's the key right there. It also has that IP address again, 192.168.1.45, and there's the MAC address. And we hard-coded that MAC address back in the virtual machine, and that's why it believes that's the MAC address, is because that's the MAC address we told it to use inside of VirtualBox. I've also got a loopback interface, and I have a wireless LAN interface. Fantastic. Here's the MAC address for that. Now this represents the alpha card that we mentioned in the install video. So that's great news. It means that this BackTrack system sees itself with a local area network wired connection. It also sees itself with the wireless interface as well that we provided through VirtualBox, direct access to that USB wireless device. Another command we can issue is IWconfig, and that'll show us our wireless information. That's really handy as well. So what this is saying is, okay, we've got one interface that supports wireless. It's wireless LAN interface 0. We have a transmit power of this amount. So I think in the US it's like 27 dBm is the max. Other countries, it's different based on whatever the rules are for the airwaves in that part of the world. So this is not currently at max power. We'll take a look at managing that a little bit later in a different nugget. And I'm currently not associated with any access point. Now, if you're in an older version of BackTrack where networking had not been started and you need to manually start the process, you can do so with this command. /etc/initd/networking space start. And it's already running on this system, so I'm not going to run it. But if you are working on an older version of BackTrack where networking hasn't been started, this is a great way to do it. You can also, on a current flavor of BackTrack, you can also use the command start space networking. And that will effectively do the same thing to start the networking services. Another thing I'd like to do right now is let's go ahead and set up support for SSH. Now to do that, we're going to need some public and private keys generated that SSH uses. To generate those keys, it's a piece of cake. The command is sshd-generate. And it's going to go through, it's going to generate the public and private key pairs that it needs. Now that the keys are generated, the next challenge is how do we train BackTrack to go ahead and listen and be open to receiving SSH connections? And the answer is we have to tell it to go ahead and start that service. And there's a couple of ways of doing that. The shortcut is typing in start SSH, and that will do it. And another way would be to use this command, and that would also start it. So the first one's a little script that automates that process. The traditional way is the way right there that we could use. Now, because it's already running, I don't need to start it again. I just want to give you both options. Maybe you're on an older version of BackTrack. I want to make sure you have every single option at your fingertips. Another really fun feature is the clear command. So if you want to clear off the screen, just type in CLEAR, press enter, and that just clears the screen. Doesn't technically do anything as far as making it faster or anything else, but if you want to have a nice fresh page to work from, clears the command for you. So let's say that you and I decide that we don't want to be DHCP clients. We want to statically assign an address. We'd want to plan on what that address is, and then we'd use an ifconfig command, specify the interface, the address, the mask, and then the state of that interface. In this case, we're going to say up. Now, if it was already up, we don't need to put the up on there again, but it's a great reminder that if your interface is down and you want to bring it up and assign an IP address, here's how you could do it with one line. If we wanted to verify the details of that command, which is a great idea, anytime we do a command, verify that it actually took, we can use ifconfig and press enter, or tag on the Ethernet 0 to just see that singular output of that interface. And here we have the information that says, yep, it took 192.168.1.222. Now that's fantastic for right now. So what's our next problem? Well, we had a default gateway because we were a DHCP client. Now we're statically configured. We'd also want to configure a default route. So we're going to go ahead and do a route add default gateway of 192.168.1.1. Now, is that the perfect default gateway to use? The answer is it is, if that literally is the default gateway. On this network that this guy's on, that happens to be the default router, the default gateway. So I'm going to tell this BackTrack machine to go ahead and use it to reach any non-local networks. So how do we test something like that? Well, we can certainly try to ping the default gateway just to make sure it's up, or ping an internet resource. Let's go ahead and do that. If that works, we know that our default routes working, our IP address is working, and everything else. Let's go ahead and ping 8.8.8.8. That's a DNS server from Google. Fantastic. And we'll do a Control-C to stop that. I want to point out that as we get into our nuggets with specific penetration testing and attacks that we're going to do, we want to be very careful not to be connected to the live internet. Why is that? Because I've seen this happen more than once. Maybe we're practicing with some type of a SYN flood attack and we're spoofing source addresses and we're throwing hundreds of thousands of SYN requests at some poor device inside our private network. But because we were randomized these source addresses, the replies are going back out to the internet from the victim as he tries to acknowledge and respond to the three-way handshake. So in this case, we're not doing any attacks at the moment, so it's not a big deal. But I would like you to pay special attention to the fact that anytime you're doing any type of testing, you don't want to be connected to live networks where you could cause harm or be singled out as somebody trying to cause harm. So let's see, we've configured a static IP address, the default gateway. What about DNS? Now, because we were a DHCP client, it's very likely that we had learned DNS server information from our DHCP server. And that information may still be hanging around in our memory banks. We can verify that by using this command. We can do a more or a cat, either way, and look at the contents of etc/resolve.conf. And that's showing us that that name server that we currently have is 192.168.1.1. Now, I did not put that there. This is a brand new system. We booted up via DHCP. So let's say that's not the name server, the DNS server we want to use. How would we change that? Well, one simple way of changing that file would be to type in echo name server, the IP address of the name server you want to use, and then send that over to that file with the greater than symbol. And that should change that for us. We do a couple up arrows and press enter, and now it's changed. So now our DNS server is 8.8.8.8. And to test that, we can do a ping, for example, of google.com or something else. And if that works, which it looks like it is, that implies that first of all, name resolution is working, and also internet connectivity is working as well. I'm going to do a Control-C to stop that ping. Our next challenge is this. If we rebooted right now, the IP address that we configured, the 222 address for our host, that would not be remembered anymore. How can we save this, make it persistent across reboots? Well, there's actually a couple ways of doing that. What I'd like to share with you is how you can edit the actual interfaces file that actually controls the information of what IP address, when this thing boots up, is going to be assigned to an interface. Now, to edit that file, we can use VI, and there's also some graphical editors we could use as well, but since we're here at the command line and we haven't kicked off the graphical user interface yet, let's go ahead and use VI, the visual editor, and we're going to edit the file called interfaces, which is in the folder of etc and the subfolder of network, and we'll simply press enter. Now at this point, if you haven't used VI in a while, Google might be your friend and help you give you some commands, but it's actually pretty simple. It's a basic editor. Now, some people love VI. I remember learning VI back in the 80s, and I've never been a huge fan of VI. However, it is simple, and it is on most operating systems of Linux, so we can go ahead and use it. So here's how we're going to start. We're going to hit the insert key, and down at the bottom, you'll notice we have this prompt that says, okay, you're now in insert mode. If I press the insert again, I'm now in replace mode. If I press it again, I go back to insert. And if I want to get out of all that, I hit escape, and that prompt goes away. So I'm going to hit insert once. I'm going to navigate down. I'm going to say for Ethernet 0, I don't want to be a DHCP client. I want to be, as I hit the backspace key, I want to be statically configured. And then I'm going to specify the details of the static IP address I want to use on this machine. So basically here we're going to replicate the information we want this system to use when it boots up. So I'm going to specify the static address, what the mask is, what the network is, what the broadcast is, which by the way, most systems would figure out just based on the IP address and the mask. They know what the network is and the broadcast. I'm also going to specify what the default gateway is. Now the trick is, how do you actually get out of this? And I'm going to hit escape. I'm going to do a colon. And then I'm going to go ahead and type in WQ. The W is for write, and the Q is to get out of town, to exit the program. And that will save it, and now it's set. So we went back and edited that again. So now when we reboot this system, it's going to have this information for its IP addresses. And also, look at this. I'm not using Ethernet 1 or Ethernet 2. I could also go ahead and remove those if we're not using them. So if you have interfaces you're sure you're not using, you could remove those as well. Now, to get out, because I'm not in insert or replace mode, I'm going to hit a colon and then simply do a Q for quit. Now, another way that we could make our static IP address persistent across reboots without editing that interfaces file is we could go ahead and do this. We could say update-rc.d space networking space defaults, press enter, and that would take our current IP address and make it part of the default startup. I've heard some reports of people using this option right here, and they've told me that their system boots a lot slower as a result. So just to keep it nice and clean, I would recommend statically configuring your IP address, edit the interface file, put it the way you want it, and then you're set. You'll never have to run this command. Now, in addition to my interfaces coming up a certain way every time I boot this device, how about having SSH enabled every time we boot this device? So it's enabled right now, but it won't be the next time we reboot unless we tell it to go ahead and make it persistent. And to do that, this command right here will simply remember those defaults for SSH being an active listening service, and every time the system reboots, the SSH service will now be automatically listening as well. In this nugget, we've taken a look at the specifics of enabling IP and specifying the IP address and other details exactly the way that we want them to be, and identified how to make them persistent across a reboot of this system. We've also enabled SSH and told SSH that we also want it to be persistent across reboots. Now, here's the great news. Check this out. All of the commands and a bunch more regarding setting up the IP addresses on BackTrack, I've included in a file, and it's available in the download folder in the Nugget Lab section for this series. That way you can refer to it and have all the commands right at your fingertips. The big thing I want to point out is that if you have an Ethernet 1 instead of Ethernet 0, please change that in the actual dock so it matches your hardware. If you have a different IP addressing scheme than 192.168.1, or if the address of 222 is already taken, again, please adjust those parameters for the actual network that you will be putting this BackTrack device on. Now, your homework assignment is simple. I want you to, number one, I'd like you to practice installing BackTrack. If you didn't do that in the previous nugget where we installed BackTrack together, maybe go revisit that, download BackTrack, install it, and then secondly, configure an IP address on your BackTrack system the way you want it to be based on this nugget. I've had a great time. I'm so glad you joined me. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.